Problems. We all have them. And some of our problems go on and on and on. 2 Samuel 12 through 14 summarizes the problems and the deteriorating circumstances that David found himself in with his family. It had been 7 years since his daughter Tamar was raped by her brother Amnon. And in those 7 years, the brother Absalom had gone through a trial. For 2 years, he spent in silence, not talking to anyone about what had happened to his sister. Then, for 3 years, he was in exile. Because if no one else was going to do something, he would, and he did. He killed his brother Amnon and went to exile, self-banishment. He came back the end of 5 years. And for the next 2 years, he stayed in Jerusalem, but not in Jerusalem where his father could see him. He was banned from his father's presence. After 2 years, they made a pretext of being reconciled. But no real reconciliation took place. Absalom had not forgotten that day of his sister's shame. That day when her brother violated her so, her brother, his brother. And that provoked him beyond endurance, especially since King David did absolutely nothing. At least he didn't think he did. It did not appear that he did because he could see no way in which Amnon had been punished for it. And as great as Absalom's crime was when he ultimately killed the brother, because he was banished and spent 3 years away, he was not seen as a offender. No, he was seen as a hero. After all, he was the avenger of his sister. He protected her name. And he did the justice that should have been done by the king. So, to some, to most, he was an avenger. In addition to that, he was certainly one with the appearance of a prince. The most handsome man in all Israel. That's how they saw him. The crown prince of noble birth. Noble because his father was his king, and on his mother's side, so was his grandfather. He deserved to be king. And yet he had spent those 3 years in banishment and 2 years now in exile from his own father, while Amnon had gone unpunished. Well, this is where we pick up the story in 2 Samuel 15. In verses 1 through 3, we see how Absalom begins to undermine the authority of his father. He did not waste his time or his revenge, first with his brother and now with his father. The crown prince was mounting a quiet insurrection against the king by taking the king's place in the eyes of the people. He collected chariots and horsemen to run before him, which was just a preliminary step of the takeover which he had planned. And he attracted attention of people not only with these chariots and horses, but by the bodyguard, those elite men who were loyal only to him and ran ahead of him, announcing his presence as he came through the city every day. Can't you see the crowds watching him, looking at him? Everyone in Jerusalem knew who he was, and they were reminded each day of his relationship to the King David. Every morning, Absalom would get up early, and he would stand by the way leading to the royal palace, and he would welcome all the visitors who came from near or far, and he showed interest in them and the reason that they came. You see, judging disputes was one responsibility that the king had. And so people would come from near and far, but only those with a real case, something that was really burning in their heart would make that long trip to Jerusalem from far away. And so every day he would sit there and he would ask them, "What city are you from?" As if he were ready to make inquiry into their case. And upon hearing their side, he gratified every one of them with a favorable opinion. "Oh, yeah, you certainly do deserve to be heard. I can understand what you're going through." And he would reach out his hand. He used so many political ploys, being approachable, offering sympathy and compassion, and of course, blaming the current administration for any problems that are going on. So when they were told from Absalom that they were certainly right and that they deserved a hearing, but unfortunately the present administration could not help because they were just too busy, their frustration would only increase. The implication was that David was just too busy or maybe too jealous of his authority to allow anyone else to take part and to delegate anything. David certainly showed weakness by allowing this to happen, but maybe David really wasn't aware, or maybe he saw what was going on with oh, that's just Absalom. He is so lovable and everybody loves him. He's just a boy. Then adding to the confusion of the people was the fact that there was no law or custom dealing with who's going to take David's place one day. The king is getting older, and he's been sick. Who's going to take his place? Absalom made it appear as though it was certainly going to be him. That's what he wanted the people to believe. And in verses 4 through 6 of chapter 15, he steals their heart. He was playing on their emotions when he presented himself as the answer to their need for justice. Words that showed he only cared for them. He had no personal interest, nothing that he could gain. This only increased his popularity. Maybe, he said, maybe it's the king's fault that there's no one to hear your case. Maybe it's just because there's a lack of officials and a lack of time to act on your cases. Whatever the reason, the government here that we've got set up is wrong, and I'm sorry that you people must suffer the consequences. He just went on, playing the role of the king. And while the people treated him with honor and wanted to show him respect, he just made himself more likable. He tried to become one of the homeboys. And so by contrasting his desire for public affairs, public welfare, and to what David's present government was like and how slowly the wheels of justice turned. What was he doing? He was creating a growing disgust with his father's government, and he stole the hearts of the multitude, who neither understood his motives nor really realized what the outcome would be. The Hebrew word stole does not mean that he actually had their affections, that they gave it their affections, but really what this word means was he deceived them and took it. Absalom stole the hearts of the people in the very same way he attempted to steal the kingdom and the throne from his father. His next ploy was religious deceit, as we see in verses 7 through 9. It's generally agreed that the text should read after 4 years, meaning that Absalom had been in town for 4 years after meeting with David. And during this 4 years, he had been planning his return. He'd been planning his vengeance of ways that he could gain popularity. So he made a request to the king. And he said, Dad, while I was in exile, I made a vow to the Lord. And I made a vow that if the Lord would bring me back, I would serve him with offering and sacrifices. And I want to go to Hebron to fulfill this vow. Now, Absalom was implying that whenever God made a way for his reestablishment in Jerusalem, restoring him to the place of God's presence, a place where he could be worshiped, and also to his father's favor, that he would offer a sacrifice. Really, what he was after was a good launching pad for his rebellion. And what better place than Hebron? Hebron was not where the vow was made, but it was where he intended to perform it. Oh, it should have, regardless of any excuses, that vow only should have been performed or carried out either in Jerusalem or in Geshur where it was made. But Absalom is sly, and he had ready excuses should his father ask. You know, Dad, it's where I was born. That's where my heart is and has always been. Well, that would seem logical. Also, Hebron, it's an ancient city. It's a place where the patriarchs made and kept their vows. And not only that, before the ark was brought to its current place in Jerusalem, it is a place where you still go and have a time of prayer. All of these would have sounded logical had Absalom revealed them. There were some other reasons that were logical as well, but reasons that Absalom would never reveal. The unnamed reasons, since it was the place of his birth, he probably still had many friends there with whom he had grown up. It was the place of where his father began his rule. And so there were some people from Hebron who might still be angry that David had moved the capital away from their city to the place of Jerusalem. And then it was 20 miles from Jerusalem. Not close enough that David could get to him so quickly if he found out about it. And finally, Hebron had great facilities for him to retreat, just in case he failed. Well, despite the justifications, the requests to go there should have been denied. But God blinded David's eyes once again so that he might bring upon both David and Absalom judgments they deserved and which he had designed. And so David, who always encouraged devotion to God and desired one to perform any religious vows promptly, gave his consent and his blessings. But one thing we have to know, a religious excuse is still just an excuse. In verses 10 through 12, these short verses here, 3 short verses, give us a picture of Absalom's revolt. This carefully prepared conspiracy, though secret from David, was very widely spread. Away from the attention of David and his loyal followers, Absalom began to enlist conspirators, sympathizers, to join his revolt. Spies were sent out to get the feeling of the people and to try to gain even more support and participation. And they wanted to influence the people and encourage them. As soon as you hear the sound that he has been proclaimed king, join us. The slogan, Absalom reigns in Hebron, alluded to David's kingdom as he was anointed king there in Hebron years ago. And since the summons was to be made by trumpet blown from town to town, word of this revolt and rebellion could quickly spread. So everyone would know the new king had been inaugurated. Absalom used worship to conceal his evil plots against the father. He was supposedly going to Hebron to offer sacrifices, which he did not do in devotion to God, for he neither feared God nor reverenced man. And it certainly wasn't to implore God's favor, because he knew quite well that it was vain to ask God to help him to overthrow his father. No, this was merely a pretense to call men to join him. And that's what he did. He called 200 influential men from Jerusalem. Now, when he called these men, he didn't tell them what was going on. He didn't tell them the reason. He just said, I'm going to offer a sacrifice in fulfillment of a vow that I have made, and then we're going to have a great feast. Come and join in the festivities. So these men innocently came. He hoped that once they came, they would give their support when they realized what was happening. And he also wanted to use them to convince other people in Jerusalem, as well as the people in Hebron, that he was going to be the new king, or at least an advisor to the aging king. But these were not military men and didn't plan on coming to use violence. Still, they would give strength to his undertaking and cause the people to think that everything he had done was with the king's blessing, and David had approved of everything. And now that he was getting older, David was in the last years of his reign, that it was time that he resigned the kingdom and just pass it on to someone of noble birth who deserved to be king. Going to Hebron also gave him the opportunity to confer with Ahithophel, David's chief political advisor, without notice. It seems likely that Ahithophel was in on the secret from the beginning. Otherwise, such a man would never have just come at Absalom's bidding. And he certainly would have never come unless he thought he was sure of the outcome. Perhaps Ahithophel turned against David because of his granddaughter Bathsheba. Or maybe it was because he saw the father was getting old and the hearts of the people really had turned toward the young prince. And he observed that this was a young, pliable man, and he thought, maybe I can probably influence him and manage him. I certainly haven't been able to do anything with David. So Absalom now had Ahithophel on his side, and because of that, it said the campaign grew. And his plan to win the northern tribes of Israel and alienate them from David succeeded. At Hebron, where his father was crowned king, Absalom's conspirators declared him king. Then he marched on Jerusalem. Verses 13 and 14 tell us how David reacted to the news. This rapid treaty in all parts of the kingdom to Absalom's party of rebels shows us just how deep the satisfaction against David as a person and David's government had grown with the people. Perhaps it was because there was still a large remnant of Saul's followers around. Maybe It was that terrible affair that became so public with Bathsheba. Then he had that general, that overbearing, insolent Joab who committed many crimes. And we can't forget, going on now was what appeared to be negligence and obstruction of justice, negligence in not answering the people, and obstruction by not taking matters of Amnon in hand as he should have. These were some of the principal causes that contributed to the success of this widespread insurrection. The messenger came with words of Absalom's speedy overtake. And the messenger said, hearts of the men of Israel were with Absalom. Taken completely by surprise of this conspiracy, David had no idea of what was going on. He had no idea that Absalom was right there, ready to come in and overtake the royal city and the kingdom. We can only wonder at the weakness of a king who left this conspiracy completely unnoticed. But if we read Psalms 41, which was written during this time, we get a great insight to the man. We see David's heart and we see some of the struggles that he was facing. And it explains also that he may have been battling illness as well as treason during these 4 years. Psalms 41 verses 1 through 5 says, "Blessed is he who considers the poor. The Lord will deliver him in time of trouble. The Lord will preserve him and keep him alive, and he will be blessed on earth. You will not deliver him to the will of his enemies. The Lord will strengthen him on his sick bed. You will sustain him on his bed of illness. I said, O Lord, be merciful to me. Heal my soul, for I have sinned against you. My enemies speak evil against me. When will he die and his name perished?" That's what David was going through. He had been going through this for 4 long years, and even longer than that, because it goes back to Amnon's death, which goes back to Tamar's rape, which goes back to the affair with Bathsheba. Many years David has been going through this, and he asked the Lord, he said, "Oh Lord, I'm on my sickbed, please heal my soul." And just as we read how Amnon's lust made his soul sick because it could not be fulfilled, now we see how guilt, even though it's forgiven, leaves memories. And these memories, which he could not forget, compounded with judgment that he knew was coming and which he was already in the middle of, could have been a great contributing factor to David's sickness. So what does David do? Unprepared to thwart Absalom's rebellion, he fled Jerusalem to avoid that unnecessary risk of life and tragedy with assault on the capital city. An immediate flight was a very wise move on the part of the king. Several reasons justified this decision to leave his strongly fortified capital. It was to avoid being shut up in the city and to prevent massacre of all the people. It was to give opportunity for his followers to gather. Going through a prolonged siege inside the city would make him look bad. Whereas if he left and he regrouped his troop and he put down the uprising, that would only show his strength as a king. And though the fort of Zion was very strong and impregnable, and he might have defended himself there for a very long time, the city was certainly not prepared for a long siege, not only with weapons, but also with food and other necessities. And if he were besieged and inside the city, Absalom could go on outside the city and quickly gain more and more followers until finally he had the whole kingdom. David was hopeful of greater support throughout the country and that he might raise an army for his defense and also to suppress those rebels. The greater part of Jerusalem could not be defended because it was so spread out. Then he didn't know who he could trust. People that he thought he could trust, Ahithophel, his chief advisor, who had turned against him. Maybe there were others who were supporting Absalom and would turn him over without thinking about it right into Absalom's hands. But a bigger reason was if Jerusalem were made the seat of war, he feared direct destruction of that city, which he very strongly desired to preserve because it was a royal city in which God had placed his name and said this would become his place of worship. David loved Jerusalem. But even more than that, and greater than that, was when David considered God's hand was now against him and that he was bringing evil from out of his own house as he has threatened. He was scared. And no wonder he was afraid and determined to leave. Next session, we're going to follow David's footsteps as he makes his journey out of Jerusalem into the wilderness. And we're going to meet people whom he encounters, both friends and enemies along the way. So until next time, be blessed.